The fog had rolled in off the Atlantic like a thick, wet wool blanket, swallowing the peaks of Swilvan and Ben Clebrig until the world consisted of nothing but the grey waters of Lochstub and the dripping eaves of the police station. It was the sort of weather that discouraged tourists, silenced the gulls, and, most important, up the telephone from ringing. Inside the station, PC Hamish Macbeth sat with his long, gangly legs propped up on his desk. He was a tall, thin man with a shock of fiery red hair and eyes the colour of the hazelnuts found in the deep woods. To a casual observer, he looked like the very picture of Highland indolence. A half-finished pot of coffee, thick and black enough to paint a fence, sat steaming on his small stove. At his feet, his dog, Lugs, let out a long, whistling sigh in his sleep, his ears twitching at some dream hare. Hamish was currently engaged in the delicate task of Ty's fishing knot for trout, but for information. He was staring at a pile of unpaid bills with the calm detachment of a philosopher. "If I don't open them, Lugs," Hamish murmured, "they don't strictly exist in this dimension. It's a matter of physics. The peace was broken not by a siren, but by the rhythmic, aggressive thwack-slosh of expensive Wellington boots marching through the mud outside." Hamish didn't move, but his hazel eyes sharpened. He knew that gait. It was the stride of someone who owned things, or at least intended to. The door swung open, bringing a gust of damp air and the scent of expensive sandalwood. In stepped a man who looked entirely too polished for a Tuesday morning in Sutherland. He wore a quilted barber jacket that had never seen a bramble and a pair of corduroy trousers in a shade of mustard that Hamish found personally offensive. "Officer, are you awake, or is this a local custom?" the man demanded. His voice was pure home counteous-lipped, arrogant, and vibrating with the impatience of a man who found the Highlands' lack of a motorway a personal insult. Hamish slowly lowered one leg, then the other, giving the newcomer a wide, vacant blink. "I am PC Macbeth, sir, and Yaud be Julian—" that is, Jeremy Smither Forbes. The man corrected himself quickly, though Hamish noted the hesitation. "I've just taken the lease on Ardvare House. I was told this was a quiet village, yet I find the local church choir is practicing at all hours. It's a racket, and someone has moved my stone lions 2 feet to the left. It's a deliberate provocation." Hamish leaned back, adopting his most gormless expression, one that usually made people talk more than they should. "Stone lions, you say? A terrible crime, to be sure. The wind can be very strong in Lochstub, Mr. Smither Forbes. It's known for its localized gravity shifts." Smither Forbes stared at him, trying to decide if he was being mocked. Hamish's face remained as blank as a freshly washed plate. "Don't be ridiculous," snapped Sassenach. "It's the locals. They resent an Englishman of means. I want a patrol. I want names. I pay a great deal in taxes, most of which, I suspect, goes toward your coffee budget." Hamish sighed inwardly. The man was a tight kind who arrived with a checkbook and a sense of superiority, destined to rub the villagers of Lochstub the wrong way until someone eventually dropped a sheep on his car. "I shall look into the matter of the wandering lions with the utmost gravity," Hamish promised, his voice thick with a fake, soothing burr. "Perhaps a nice cup of tea would calm your nerves. The water is almost boiling." "I don't want tea. I want results." Smither Forbes turned on his heel and marched back out into the fog. Hamish watched him go, the lazy mask slipping just for a second. There was something about the man's icer flicker of nervous energy that didn't quite match his bluster about stone lions. "He's hiding something, Lugs," Hamish said, reaching for his cap. "And in a village like this, hiding things is the most popular local sport. I think we'd better go see Mrs. Kennedy at the post office. She'll know exactly how much that barber jacket cost, and whose wife he's already offended." He stepped out into the mist, the cold air biting at his cheeks. It was a quiet morning, but Hamish could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The fog wasn't just weather today, it felt like a curtain waiting to rise on a very messy stage. The fog had thickened by the time Hamish reached the centre of the village, turning the stone cottages of Lochstub into ghostly grey shapes that loomed out of the damp. It was the kind of morning where the silence felt heavy, muffled by the mist, until it was punctured by a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the cry of a gull or the distant bleat of a sheep. It was a high, thin wail, like a kettle left whistling on a stove, coming from the direction of the old kirk. Hamish adjusted his cap and whistled low for Lugs. The dog, usually keen on chasing the scent of a stray rabbit or a bit of discarded fish supper, was uncharacteristically hesitant. He stood with his hackles slightly raised, sniffing the salt-heavy air, with a low growl vibrating in his chest. "Easy, man," Hamish murmured, though a cold prickle of intuition was already dancing down his spine. "It's likely just Mrs. Wellington finding a mouse in the collection plate." But as he rounded the corner of the graveyard, the source of the noise became clear. It was Mary Lahone, the village's most dedicated gossip and a soprano of questionable pitch in the church choir. She was standing by the heavy oak doors of the kirk, her hands pressed to her cheeks, her mouth open in a perfect O of horror. Hamish quickened his pace, his long legs eating up the distance. "Now then, Mary. What's all the fuss? Has the vicar run out of communion wine again?" Mary didn't answer. She simply pointed a trembling finger toward the interior of the church. Hamish stepped inside. The air was frigid, smelling of old paper, floor wax, and something metallic and sharp that cut through the scent of incense. He followed Mary's gaze upward, toward the choir loft that overlooked the nave. There, draped over the mahogany railing like a discarded coat, was a body. It was the newcomer, the man who had only an hour before been complaining about his stone lions. Jeremy Smither Forbes was no longer looking polished or arrogant. He was hanging precariously over the edge of the loft, his expensive mustard-coloured corduroys caught on a decorative brass sconce. His head hung down, his face a mottled, puffy purple that clashed horribly with his barber jacket. But it was the manner of his death that struck Hamish as particularly bizarrined, particularly locked-up. Around the man's neck, pulled tight and knotted with professional precision, was a thick, braided bell rope. The other end of the rope disappeared into the belfry. It looked as though someone had tried to ring the noon bells using the Sassenach as a human clapper. "Oh, man," Hamish sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "And I was just about to put the stew on." His annoyance was genuine. A murder meant paperwork. It meant phone calls to the mainland. It meant the arrival of the professionals from Strathbane, who would stomp through his village with their muddy boots and their even muddier logic. Most importantly, it meant his quiet day of avoiding the world was officially over. He walked up the narrow, winding stone stairs to the choir loft, his boots echoing in the hollow silence of the kirk. Lugs followed, whining softly. When Hamish reached the summit, he saw the scene in its full, grim absurdity. The loft was scattered with sheet music handles Messiah, appropriately enough, and a small silver flask lay overturned near the victim's outstretched hand. Hamish knelt, careful not to disturb anything, though he didn't need a forensics kit to see the obvious. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned chairs. It looked as though Smither Forbes had been standing peacefully at the railing when the rope had dropped from the ceiling like a noose and jerked him upward. He looked at the victim's hands. They were soft, manicured, and currently clutching a small, crumpled piece of paper. Hamish didn't touch it not yet, but he leaned in close. On the paper, written in a cramped, hurried hand, were the words, "The lions have moved again." Lions, Hamish muttered to himself. The man was obsessed with his garden ornaments, while his own neck was about to be stretched. He stood up and looked out the small stained-glass window that faced the village square. Below, the mist was parting just enough to reveal a sleek, black police cruiser pulling up to the curb. It wasn't a local car. It was high-powered, aggressive, and currently splashing a massive puddle over the shoes of the village minister. Hamish groaned. He recognized that car. It belonged to Detective Chief Inspector Blair. The big man himself was arriving early, likely tipped off by a frantic Mary Lahone before Hamish had even had a chance to breathe. "Right then, Lugs," Hamish said, patting the dog's head. "Time to put on the stupid face. We've got company, and he's going to be in a foul mood." He descended the stairs just as the heavy kirk doors were kicked open. DCI Blair marched in, followed by his two shadows, Detectives Anderson and MacNab. Blair was a man built like a sack of coal, with a face the colour of a slapped tomato and a temperament that suggested he had spent his entire life being denied a promotion he felt he deserved. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice bouncing off the vaulted ceiling and shaking the dust from the rafters. "I might have known. I haven't even had my breakfast, and I am dragged out to this god-forsaken heap of wet rocks because you can't keep your locals from killing each other." Hamish stood at the bottom of the stairs, shoulders slumped, looking as though he might fall asleep at any moment. "It's a sad business. Mr. Smither Forbes, he was a newcomer, just moved into Ardvare House." Blair stomped toward the choir loft, barely glancing at the body hanging above him. "I don't care if he moved into the Queen's bedroom, Macbeth. Who did it? I want a name, a motive, and a confession by tea time. And don't give me any of that Highland intuition rubbish. If You'd been doing your job instead of poaching salmon, this man would still be breathing." "I was actually in the station, sir," Hamish said mildly. "Contemplating the bills. Contemplating your navel. More like," Blair spat. He looked at the body and snorted. "Hanged in a church? It's obvious, isn't it? A religious maniac, or a disgruntled bell ringer." "MacNab! Go find out who rings the bells in this dump and arrest them." "But, sir," Hamish interjected, his voice soft and hesitant. "The bells haven't been rung in years. The mechanism is rusted solid. To use that rope, someone would have had to climb into the belfry and thread it through the floorboards manually." Blair turned on him, his eyes bulging. "Are you telling me how to do my job, you ginger-haired peasant?" "I say it's a bell ringer, so find me a bell ringer. Now, get out of my sight and go make yourself useful. Go find the widow and tell her she's a suspect. Or find the postmistress and see who's been sending poison pen letters. Just stay out of my way before I have you transferred to the traffic division in Glasgow." Hamish nodded obediently, backing away toward the door. "As you say, sir, a bell ringer. Very logical." As he stepped out into the cold Highland air, Hamish's eyes were no longer vacant. He looked back at the kirk, then toward the fog-shrouded roof of Ardvair House on the hill. Blair would spend the next 6 hours bullying the local choir and making enemies of everyone in Lochtub. But Hamish knew the truth lay elsewhere. It wasn't about religion, and it certainly wasn't about the bells. It was about those stone lions, and the fact that an arrogant Englishman had been frightened of his own garden. "Come on, Lux," Hamish whispered. "Let's go see if the hotel has any scones left. I have a feeling we're going to need the energy for all the listening we're about to do." The fog had lifted just enough to reveal the true chaos descending upon Lochtub. The quiet square was now cluttered with Strathbane police vans, their tyres churning the soft Highland turf into a brown slurry. Detective Chief Inspector Blair stood in the centre of it all, his face a shade of crimson that suggested a looming medical emergency. He was currently screaming at a bewildered Detective Macnab, who was holding a damp clipboard as if it were a shield. Hamish Macbeth watched from the periphery, leaning against the post office's stone wall with his hands buried deep in his pockets. Lugg sat by his side, his head tilting back and forth as if following the rhythm of Blair's insults. To any passing villager, Hamish looked like a man who had forgotten he was on duty, a lazy constable content to let the big city detectives do the heavy lifting. In reality, he was cataloguing every mistake Blair was making, which, by Hamish's count, was roughly 1 per minute. "I don't care if the man was a saint or a swindler," Blair's voice carried across the loch, echoing off the hills. "He's hanging from a bell rope in a kirk. That's theatrical, Macnab. That's a grudge. It's local. I want every member of this choir at school to question. And find me the keys to Ardvair House. I am going to toss that place until I find a motive." Blair's eyes suddenly landed on Hamish. The DCI stomped over, his heavy boots splashing mud onto Hamish's neatly polished if old shoes. "You! Macbeth! Why are you standing there like a garden gnome? I thought I told you to get to work." "I was just observing the perimeter, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a slow, rhythmic Highland drawl that always seemed to irritate Blair further. "It's a very complex perimeter, what with the mist and the sheep." "The sheep?" Blair roared, his neck veins bulging. "I've got a dead Englishman with a rope around his neck, and you're talking about livestock. This is why Yow'll never be more than a village bobby, Macbeth. You've got the brain of a turnip. Now, get up to Ardvair House and stand guard at the gate. Don't let anyone in. Not the press, not the locals, and especially not that nosy Halberton Smythe woman. If I see you moving from that spot before I get there, I'll have you directing traffic in the middle of the Clyde." "As you wish, sir," Hamish said, touching the brim of his cap with a languid gesture. "I'll just be on my way then. Very busy, the gate standing business." Blair snorted and turned back to his team, barking orders about forensic sweeps and DNA swabs things Hamish knew would yield very little in a building as old and drafty as the Lochtub Kirk. The DCI was looking for a modern criminal, someone who left fingerprints and digital trails. He didn't understand that in the Highlands, a man's history was written in the way he tipped his hat or the way he kept his garden. Hamish didn't go straight to Ardvair House. Instead, he took the long way round, cutting through the narrow alley behind the grocery store. He knew Blair's aggressive tactics would cause the village to clam up. The Highlanders didn't respond well to shouting. They responded to tea, a sympathetic ear, and the shared understanding that the police from the city were a necessary but temporary infestation. He found himself outside the kitchen door of the Lochtub Hotel. The smell of frying bacon and old wood smoke wafted through the air, a far more inviting prospect than a crime scene. He knocked gently and stepped inside. Mrs. Patterson, the cook, was standing at a massive iron stove, her face flushed from the heat. She looked up and sighed, but there was a flicker of fondness in her eyes. "I suppose Yow'll be wanting a cup of coffee and a bit of news, Hamish. I heard about that poor man in the kirk. Mary Lahona's been here 3 times already. Each time the story gets more dramatic. Last I heard, the man was decapitated and singing hymns. Just a hanging, Mrs. Patterson," Hamish said, pulling up a stool. "And a very quiet one at that. No one heard a thing, despite it being a choir practice night." Did Mr. Smither Forbes stayed here when he arrived? He did, she said, sliding a thick mug of coffee and a buttered scone toward him. And a more unpleasant man I've never had the displeasure of feeding. Complained about the pillows, complained about the salt in the butter, and complained about the dreadful noise of the waves. He acted as if the Atlantic Ocean was a personal grievance. Hamish took a slow sip of the coffee, letting the heat settle his nerves. Did he have visitors? Does anyone from the village have a particular dislike for him? Mrs. Patterson leaned in, lowering her voice. He had a row with Archie McLean over the boundary wall at Ardvare. Called Archie a primitive because he wouldn't move a stone cairn. But there was something else, Hamish. A woman visited him last week. Not a local. Dressed in one of those sharp suits that cost more than my house. They argued in the library for 2 hours. When she left, she looked like she wanted to set the building on fire. Hamish nodded, his mind whirring beneath his calm exterior. Blair was busy arresting bell ringers and shouting at choir girls, but the real story was in the sharp suits and the boundary disputes. Did you catch her name, Mrs. Patterson? I didn't. But she left a cigarette end in the ashtray. Gold-tipped, very fancy. I threw it out, of course, but I remember the smell, like lilies and old money. Hamish finished his scone and stood up. You're a treasure, Mrs. Patterson. If DCI Blair comes in here asking questions, you tell him I've been working very hard at the gate, won't you? I'll tell him you were the very picture of dedication, Hamish, she chuckled. As he walked back out into the cooling afternoon, Hamish felt the weight of the case beginning to take shape. Blair was looking for a monster, but Hamish knew he was looking for a person Semione, pushed to the brink by an arrogant man who thought he could buy the Highlands. He began the long trek up the hill toward Ardvare House, lugs trotting faithfully behind him. He had a gate to guard, but he also had a set of stone lions to inspect. And he had a feeling that those lions held a secret that DCI Blair wouldn't find even if he stayed in Lockstub for 100 years. The iron gates of Ardvare House were cold and slick with the Highland mist, but Hamish didn't spend much time standing at attention. He knew Blair was busy back at the schoolhouse, likely reducing a teenage altar boy to tears over the technicalities of bell rope knots. Trusting that the DCI's ego would keep him occupied for at least an hour, Hamish left lugs to guard the entrancier task. The dog performed by curling into a ball and falling instantly asleep and began a slow, circuitous wander back toward the heart of the village. To an outsider, Hamish appeared to be drifting aimlessly, a man with nowhere to go and nothing to do. He stopped to admire a patch of lichen on a drystone dike. He paused to watch a grey seal bobbing in the harbour. But his path was deliberate. It led him straight to the back door of the village post office, where the scent of floor wax and old paper mingled with the faint, sweet aroma of peppermint. Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, was the unofficial keeper of Lockstub's secrets. She knew who was in debt, who was having an affair, and exactly who was receiving packages from suspicious London boutiques. As Hamish entered, the bell above the door gave a cheerful tinkle. I heard Blair is in a state, Hamish, she said without looking up from her ledger. They say his face is so red you could use it as a portlight for the evening ferry. It's a vivid shade, to be sure, Mrs. Kennedy, Hamish replied, leaning casually against the counter. He looked down at his boots, appearing slightly defeated. He's got me guarding a gate that hasn't been locked since the clearances. It's thirsty work, standing in the fog. Mrs. Kennedy sighed, reached beneath the counter, and produced a tin of shortbread and a thermos. Sit before you fall, man. You look like you haven't had a decent meal since the New Year. I suppose you want to know about the Sassenach. Hamish took a piece of shortbread, crumbling it slightly as he chewed. Jeremy Smither Forbes, a man of high standards and low patience, by all accounts. He was a nightmare, Mrs. Kennedy said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He came in here every day to complain about the post, said his important documents were being delayed by what he called Gaelic incompetence. But it wasn't the post he was worried about, Hamish. It was the visitors. He was terrified of anyone seeing who came to that big house. Hamish tilted his head, his eyes sharpening despite his relaxed posture. Visitors, beyond the lady in the sharp suit Mrs. Patterson mentioned. Oh, her! That was a lawyer, ID wager. But there was another. A man. Small, wiry, looked like he'd been scrubbed too hard with lye. He arrived on the bus from Inverness 3 nights ago. Didn't stay at the hotel. I walked straight up to Ardvare in the dark and didn't come down until 4 in the morning. I saw him from my window. Did he carry a bag? A small one. And he walked like a man who knew exactly where he was going. Not a tourist's gate, Hamish. A local's gate, though I didn't recognize the face. Hamish nodded, making a mental note. A local's gate in a stranger's body. That was a Highland riddle if ever he'd heard one. He moved on from the post office, his mooching next taking him to the back of the curry shop. Mr. Patel was back, shaking a rug. He greeted Hamish with a weary smile. "The big policeman from the city," Mr. Patel said, jerking his thumb toward the schoolhouse. "He came in earlier, demanded to see my staff's immigration papers. In Lochtub. I told him my nephew was born in Glasgow and has a thicker accent than he does. He didn't find it funny. Blair has a surgical removal of the humour centres," Hamish said sympathetically. "Did your nephew see anything near the Kirk last night? He usually makes late deliveries." Mr. Patel paused, his expression turning thoughtful. "Young Sanjay did say he saw a light in the belfry. But not a torch, Hamish. A blue light. Like a camera flash, or one of those fancy electronic gadgets. And he saw something else of my own moving the stone lions at Ardver. He thought it was the wind, but then he saw a shadow, a tall shadow, with a limp." Hamish leaned against the wall, his mind knitting the pieces together. A blue light in a dark church. A man with a limp moving heavy stone ornaments. A lawyer with a gold-tipped cigarette. It was a messy tapestry, far removed from Blair's theory of a disgruntled bell-ringer. "You're a good man, Mr. Patel. If you have any of those vegetable pakoras left over, I wouldn't want them to go to waste." With a small bag of warm pakoras tucked into his jacket, Hamish made his way toward the harbour. He sat on a cold stone bollard, sharing a piece of fried batter with a persistent gull. He looked up at the kirk on the hill. The blue light was the most troubling detail. In a world of ancient stone and rusted ropes, a blue light spoke of the modern world intruding on Lochtub's shadows. He thought about the note in the dead man's hand. "The lions have moved again." It wasn't the complaint of a madman. It was the observation of a man who knew he was being watched, being toyed with. Someone had been gaslighting Smither Forbes, moving his heavy ornaments inch by inch to unnerve him before finally dropping the noose. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the water, Hamish saw a familiar figure walking along the pier. It was Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She was dressed in a perfectly tailored tweed coat, her blonde hair caught in the wind. She was the one person who could bridge the gap between Hamish's world and the world of people like Smither Forbes. "Hamish!" she shouted, her voice clear and cool. "I hear you've been relegated to gate duty while Blair tries to arrest the entire parish council." "It's a peaceful life, Priscilla," Hamish said, standing up and brushing the crumbs from his trousers. "Though the conversation with the gateposts is a bit one-sided." "Come," she said, gesturing toward her car. "I've had a look at the guest list for the housewarming party Smither Forbes never got to hold. There are names that might interest you, and I think it's time we discussed why an English property developer was so interested in a ruined chapel with no roof and no floor." Hamish followed her, his lazy gait hiding the fact that his heart was starting to beat a little faster. The village gossip was leading him somewhere dark, and he knew that before the night was out, he'd have to find a way to stop Blair from arresting an innocent man and find the person who knew how to tie a perfect knot in a rusted rope. The interior of Priscilla Halberton Smythe's Volvo was clean, smelling of expensive leather and a faint hint of wood smoke. It was a stark contrast to the salt-crusted police Land Rover Hamish usually piloted. As Priscilla turned the key, the engine purred with a refined efficiency that made Hamish feel suddenly very aware of his own frayed cuffs and the faint scent of pakoras clinging to his jacket. "You look tired, Hamish," Priscilla said, her eyes fixed on the narrow, winding road that led away from the harbour. "And don't try to tell me it's the burden of guarding a gate. You've been thinking, which is always much more exhausting for you. It's a heavy weight, a brain." Hamish sighed, leaning his head back against the headrest. "Especially when DCI Blair is trying his best to make sure no one else in the county is using theirs. He's convinced it's a local grudge. He's currently looking for a bell ringer with a motive, which in Lochtub means he's narrowed it down to anyone over the age of 60 who isn't bedridden." Priscilla navigated a sharp bend with effortless grace. "He's looking in the wrong century, as usual. Jeremy Smither Forbes wasn't killed by a villager upset about a noisy choir. He was killed for what he was doing to the land. My father had a few dealings with him regarding the estates. The man wasn't just a developer, he was a specialist in distressed assets. He bought things that people didn't want, or things they didn't realize they owned." She pulled the car over into a small passing place overlooking the loch. The water below was like black glass, reflecting the purple bruised clouds of the evening sky. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a slender folder. "I did some digging into the Ardver lease," she continued, handing the folder to Hamish. "Smither Forbes didn't just rent the house. He bought a small, neglected parcel of land behind the old kirk, a place called St. Ronan's Rest. It's nothing but a pile of stones and a few ancient graves now." Hamish flipped through the papers, his hazel eyes scanning the legalese. Why would a man who complains about the smell of sheep want a pile of damp stones? Because of what's underneath them, perhaps, Priscilla suggested, watching him closely. There's a rumour in the upper-class circles the kind of people who drink too much gin at Hunt Bolstat St. Ronan's wasn't just a chapel. It was a waypoint for the Jacobites. There are stories of hidden caches, gold sent from France that never reached the prince. Most people dismiss it as folklore, but Smither Forbes was a man who believed in the bottom line, not folklore. Hamish looked at the darkening landscape. The Sassenach tension he had felt earlier began to make more sense. Smither Forbes hadn't been an arrogant outsider just by nature. He had been a man on a mission, one that required him to keep the locals at arm's length while he poked around in the village's history. The stone lions, Hamish murmured. He said they were being moved. If someone was digging or searching for a hidden entrance, they'd have to move things. And if they wanted to drive him out or distract him, they'd start playing with his mind. Priscilla reached out, her hand resting briefly on Hamish's arm. The gesture was fleeting, but it sent a familiar, complicated jolt through him. You have to be careful, Hamish. If there is something of value there, whoever killed him isn't going to stop because a village policeman is asking questions. Blair is a buffoon, but he's a loud buffoon. He draws the lightning. You, on the other hand, are quiet. That makes you dangerous to someone who wants to stay hidden. I am just a simple bobby, Priscilla, Hamish said, the lie coming easily to his lips. I am more interested in where my next coffee is coming from than Jacobite gold. Don't lie to me, Hamish Macbeth. It's insulting to both of us. Her voice was soft but held a sharp edge of disappointment. You've already worked it out, haven't you? Or at least most of it. You're just waiting for the last piece to fall into your lap. Hamish looked at her, and for a moment the mask of the lazy constable dropped entirely. I know that he was scared. And I know the man who killed him knew the Kirk better than any tourist. They knew how to get into the belfry without being seen, and they knew how to tie a knot that would hold the weight of a grown man. It wasn't a crime of passion, Priscilla. It was a cold, calculated removal of an obstacle. And the woman? Priscilla asked. The one Mrs. Patterson saw. A lawyer, likely, Hamish said. Or a partner, someone who stood to gain if the asset was cleared. But she wouldn't be the one climbing belfries. Shed hire that out. Priscilla started the car again. I'll drop you back at the station. My father is hosting a dinner tonight for some of the local landowners. I'll see what I can pick up about Smither Forbes' recent acquisitions. Just promise me you won't go up to that Kirk alone tonight. I have lugs, Hamish said with a small, crooked smile. He's a fierce beast when he's not napping. As she dropped him off in the village square, the rain began to fall in earnester cold, stinging Highland rain that blurred the lights of the hotel. Hamish stood on the pavement, watching the red taillights of Priscilla's car disappear into the gloom. He felt a pang of the old longing, the realization that despite their connection, they lived in two different worlds. She was the lady of the manor, and he was the man who poached her father's salmon. But the mystery didn't care about social standing. He turned toward the dark silhouette of the Kirk on the hill. Blair was still in the schoolhouse, his shadow projected against the frosted glass as he paced and shouted. Hamish, however, didn't head for the schoolhouse. He headed for the station to get a heavy torch and a dry coat. Priscilla had given him the motive, and the village had given him the gossip. Now, he needed to find the man with the limp and the blue light. As he walked, he realized something he had ignored before. The piece of paper in the dead man's hand hadn't been a complaint. It had been a warning. And if the lions were moving again, it meant the killer was still on the grounds. The rain had turned the village square into a shimmering black mirror by the time Hamish reached the schoolhouse. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wet wool and DCI Blair's cheap cigars. Blair was leaning over a desk, his face triumphant, while Detective Macnab stood by with a pair of handcuffs looking decidedly nervous. In the centre of the room sat Archie McLean, a weather-beaten crofter whose hands were permanently stained with the grease of tractor engines and the peat of the hills. "It's over, Macbeth!" Blair barked as Hamish drifted into the room, looking like a man who had accidentally wandered into the wrong party. "While you were out playing footsie with the local aristocracy, I've been doing real police work. We found the evidence. Arrest the man Macnab." Hamish blinked slowly, his gaze shifting to Archie. The crofter looked less like a murderer and more like a man who had been interrupted in the middle of a very good nap. "Evidence, sir. It's very fast work." "What did you find?" "A signed confession in the collection plate." Blair ignored the sarcasm, his chest swelling. "Better. We searched McLean's shed. We found a rope length, Macbeth. The exact same gauge and weave as the one used to lynch that poor sod in the Kirk. And we found a map of the Ardvere estate with the boundary lines marked in red ink. Maclean here had a motivia land disputine. He had the means. He's a former sailor, isn't he? He knows his knots. Archie Maclean spat into a nearby wastepaper basket. I told you, you great pudding of a man, that rope is for securing the winter hay, and the map was given to me by Smither Forbes himself, so I'd know where to build the new fence. Not that I was going to build it, mind you. The man was a nuisance. Quiet! Blair slammed his hand on the desk. You were seen arguing with him at the pub. He threatened to stretch his neck if he touched the cairn on the hill. It's an open and shut case. Take him down to the cells in Strathbane. Hamish stepped forward, his expression one of mild, puzzled concern. He reached out and picked up the piece of rope Blair had laid out as an exhibit. He flipped it in his long fingers, sniffing it once. It's fine rope, to be sure, Hamish said softly. But there's a small problem, sir. Just a tiny, insignificant thing that a big city detective might not notice. Blair's eyes narrowed into slits. And what would that be, P.C. Macbeth? This rope is steeped in Stockholm tar, Hamish explained, holding it up to the light. It's what sailors use to preserve hemp against the salt air. It has a very distinct, pungent smell. But the rope in the kirk, the one around Mr. Smither Forbes' neck, that was clean. It was dry-braided nylon, the kind you buy at a modern hardware store in Inverness. It didn't smell of the sea, it smelled of a factory. He turned to Archie. And Archie here hasn't used nylon for anything in 40 years. He says it slips in the hand and insults the spirit of the work. Archie nodded vigorously. Right you are, Hamish. Plastic rubbish it is. Blair's face went from red to a dangerous shade of plum. I don't care about the smell. A rope is a rope. He's a local, he's a brute, and he's going in the back of the van. There's also the matter of the cat, Hamish added, his voice dropping into that deceptively casual register that signalled he was about to deliver a blow. The cat? Blair roared. What bloody cat? The victim's cat, sir. A ginger Persian named Napoleon. Mister. Smither Forbes mentioned to the postmistress that the cat had gone missing 3 days ago. He was quite distraught about it. Now, Archie Maclean here is well known in Lockstub for many things she's temper, his poaching, and his terrible singing. But everyone knows he's a soft touch for animals. He spends half his pension on salmon cans for the strays behind the hotel. If Archie had been stalking Ardvare House with murder in his heart, he'd have found that cat and brought it home. But the cat is still missing. Hamish paused, looking Blair straight in the eye. And more importantly, sir, if you arrest Archie now, the whole village will stop talking to you. You won't find a witness, you won't find a confession, and you'll have a riot on your hands before the pubs close. Is that the kind of results they're looking for back in Strathbane? Blair hovered on the edge of a fresh explosion, but the logica, perhaps the fear of a paperwork nightmare finally took hold. He turned his rage on MacNab. Why didn't you check the rope material? Useless. Both of you. Fine, release him. But don't think you're off the hook, Maclean. I am watching you. Archie stood up, adjusted his cap, and gave Hamish a brief, knowing nod before walking out into the rain. Well, Blair snapped, turning back to Hamish. If it's not the local thug, then who is it? You seem to have all the answers, Macbeth. Who killed the Sassenach? I don't have the answers yet, sir, Hamish said, looking remarkably gormless again. I am just a bit confused by the little things. Like why a man who was about to be murdered was worried about his garden statues. Or why there's a man with a limp wandering the hills who doesn't show up on any of your census reports. Blair snorted. A man with a limp? Probably just some old drunk falling over a peat bank. Back to your post, Macbeth, and stay there. If I find you investigating again, I'll have your badge. Hamish tipped his cap and stepped back out into the night. The red herring had been cleared, but the clock was ticking. Blair was getting desperate, which meant he would soon try to arrest someone else likely, someone even more innocent than Archie. Hamish whistled for Lugs, who appeared from the shadows of the schoolhouse porch. The rope was the wrong rope. Lugs, Hamish whispered, as they walked toward the dark path leading up to the kirk. And the motive is the wrong motive. It wasn't a border fence. It was about what was being dug up under the cover of the fog. He pulled a small, high-powered torch from his pocket. He wasn't going to the gate this time. He was going back to the belfry. He needed to see that rope Aganathi nylon one, because if he was right, the killer hadn't just used it to kill Smither for Forbes. They had used it as a winch. The wind had risen, turning the Highland mist into a fine, horizontal spray that stung the eyes. Hamish climbed the path to the kirk, his boots silent on the sodden turf. Behind him, the lights of Lochtub flickered like dying embers, but ahead, the old stone structure loomed like a fortress of the dead. Luggs stayed close to his heels, his tail tucked lower, sure sign that the dog sensed something more than just the cold. Hamish entered the kirk through the side vestry door, which he had left unlocked earlier. He didn't turn on his torch yet. He sat in the darkness of the back pew, listening. The building groaned as the wind battered the rafters, and the smell of old stone and cold ash was overwhelming. He sat for 10 minutes, perfectly still, letting his eyes adjust and his ears filter out the natural sounds of the night. He wasn't looking for a ghost. He was looking for the why that Blair had missed. Blair thought the murder was about a man being hated, but Hamish knew that in the Highlands, hate was usually a slow-burning fire. This murder was cold and efficient, a professional removal of a tenant who had become a nuisance. Hamish stood up and made his way back to the choir loft. He clicked on his torch, the narrow beam cutting through the gloom. He didn't look at where the body had been instead. He shone the light straight up into the belfry. The nylon rope still dangled there, its end frayed where the forensics team had cut it. He climbed the wooden ladder into the belfry itself, a cramped space filled with the skeletal remains of the old bell mechanism and decades of pigeon droppings. He knelt by the heavy oak floorboards and began to probe the gaps. Near the corner where the rope passed through, he saw it, a fresh scrape in the wood, as if something very heavy and metallic had been dragged across it. Not a human clapper, lugs, Hamish whispered. A hoist. He followed the scrapes to the far corner of the belfry, behind a stack of rotting timber. There, he found a loose floorboard. Beneath it wasn't a hidden cache of Jacobite gold, but something much more modern. He pulled out a small, high-tech electronic Devasia ground-penetrating radar unit, the kind used by archaeologists or, more likely, high-end treasure hunters. The blue light Sanjay had seen hadn't been a camera flash. It had been the screen of this device. The motive snapped into focus. Jeremy Smither Forbes hadn't been a simple developer. He had been a front. He had leased Ardvare House and the surrounding land because he had a map, perhaps one passed down, through his own family, showing that the St. Ronan's Rest Chapel sat atop a sealed stone vault. But Smither Forbes had been too loud, too arrogant. He had drawn too much attention to himself with his complaints and his post office rants. The person who killed him didn't want the gold discovered by a man who would report it to the authorities and the Crown. They wanted it for themselves, and they needed Smither for Forbes gone so they could finish the excavation in peace. Hamish climbed down from the belfry, his mind racing. Who knew enough about the land to know where to dig? Who had the local gate that Mrs. Kennedy had described, but wasn't a local? He thought back to the man with the limp. It wasn't a drunkard stumble. It was a specific rhythmic hitch in the step. The man from the bus, Hamish muttered. The one who arrived from Inverness. He made his way out of the kirk and toward the boundary wall of Ardvare House. He didn't go to the gate. He went to the spot where the stone lions stood. In the beam of his torch, he saw the deep ruts in the soft earth. The lions hadn't been moved by ghosts or a prankster. They had been moved because they sat directly over a drainage tunnel that led from the house toward the kirk. The killer wasn't staying in a hotel or a croft. They were living in the house itself, hidden in the labyrinthine servant quarters or the cellar, while Smither Forbes had blustered about in the main rooms. Suddenly, the beam of his torch caught a flicker of movement near the garden shed. It was a man, small and wiry, carrying a heavy canvas bag. He walked with a distinct limp. But as he turned toward the light, Hamish didn't see a stranger. He saw a face that was hauntingly familiar, a face he had seen in the old photographs in the village hall. It was the dead brother of the village minister, a man named Fergus, who had supposedly emigrated to Australia 20 years ago after a scandal involving the church funds. He hadn't emigrated, he had been in prison, and he had come home to claim what he thought was his birthright. But Fergus wasn't alone. From the shadows of the porch, a taller figure stepped out. She was wearing a waterproof trench coat, her blonde hair tucked under a dark cap. "I told you he was too smart for his own good, Fergus," the woman said. Her voice was cool, cultured, and entirely devoid of the warmth she had shown Hamish in the car only hours before. Hamish felt a cold lump form in his stomach. It wasn't Priscillath hair, was the wrong shade under the torchlight, but the resemblance was striking. It was her cousin, Penelope, the lawyer who had been seen arguing with the victim. "You should have stayed at the gate, Hamish," Penelope said, stepping into the light. She wasn't holding a cigarette this time. She was holding a small, very professional-looking black pistol. "It's a much safer place for a man of your limited ambitions." Hamish stood very still. Luggs let out a low, menacing snarl, his teeth bared. "It was never about the lions, was it?" Hamish said, his voice remarkably steady. "It was about the vault. You used Fergus because he knew the tunnels from when he was a boy playing in the kirk. And you used Smither Forbes as the bankroll until he got too nervous and started writing notes about moving statues. You couldn't have him calling the police, could you?" "Jeremy was a liability," Penelope said dismissively. He thought he was the lead partner. He didn't realize he was just the leaseholder. Now, Fergus, put the bag in the car. We have a small problem to dispose of. The petty and human motive was laid bare. Greed, seasoned with a bit of family resentment and a long-held grudge. It was the oldest story in the Highlands, clad in modern nylon rope and electronic sensors. Hamish looked at the gun, then at the dark woods behind them. He was alone, outgunned, and DCI Blair was currently 2 miles away, accusing a choirboy of murder. He needed a distraction, and he needed it fast. "You know, Penelope," Hamish said, slipping back into his most talkative, rambling tone. "The problem with nylon rope is that it's very slippery. If you're not careful with the knots, things tend to come loose." The rain continued to fall in a steady, monotonous drone, blurring the edges of the world, until the only thing that felt real was the cold barrel of the pistol glinting in the torchlight. Hamish Macbeth stood his ground, his shoulders slumped in that characteristic posture of defeated resignation that had fooled many a more formidable opponent than Penelope. "It's a terrible thing, Greed," Hamish said, his voice a soft rhythmic burr that seemed to blend with the wind. "It makes folk do things that aren't in their nature. Like climbing into cold belfries or moving heavy stones in the middle of a Highland gale. It must be very tiring for you, Penelope, keeping all these plates spinning." Penelope's eyes narrowed. "Don't try to charm me, Hamish. I'm not a village girl impressed by a uniform and a bit of red hair." "Fergus, get the car started. We're leaving." "But you can't leave just yet," Hamish said, taking a small, seemingly accidental step to the left, drawing their attention away from the garden shed. "Not while DCI Blair is about to stumble onto the real treasure. You see, Blair might be a loud-mouthed pudding, but he's a persistent one. He's already found the blue light Sanjay saw. He's up at the kirk right now with a team from Strathbane, digging up the floorboards of the vestry. It was a blatant lie, delivered with the absolute, wide-eyed sincerity of a man who wouldn't know a falsehood if it bit him. Hamish knew Blair was currently at the police station, likely nursing a glass of whiskey and complaining about the lack of decent catering in Lochtub. Fergus, the wiry man with the limp, froze. He looked toward the dark silhouette of the kirk on the hill. "The vestry, but we haven't cleared the vault under the vestry yet, Penelope. If they find the stone seal before we get the rest of the coins out—" "Shut up, Fergus," Penelope snapped, but the seed of doubt had been planted. She turned her gaze to Hamish. "You're lying. Blair doesn't have the brains to find his own feet in the dark." "Oh, I agree with you there," Hamish said cheerfully. "But he has a lot of men with shovels and a very big desire to be on the evening news. He thinks he's found a Jacobite hoard. If he opens that seal tonight, the Crown takes everything. All that work you did, all that trouble with the nylon rope, all for nothing." Hamish watched the calculation unfold behind Penelope's eyes. She was a woman of the city cold, logical, and driven by the bottom line. The idea of her treasure being hauled away by a man like Blair was more than she could stomach. "The lions," Hamish continued, leaning into the deception. "Sanjay saw them moving, he told Blair. Blair realized the lions were just markers for the tunnel system. He's not as stupid as he looks, well, he is, but he's lucky. And luck is a dangerous thing for a criminal to go up against. We have to stop them," Fergus hissed, his voice cracking with desperation. "That gold is mine. It's been in the story since my grandfather's time. I am not letting some city detective take it." "Fergus, stay where you are," Penelope commanded, but her own grip on the gun had wavered. She looked toward the kirk, where a faint, flickering light appeared in one of the high windows. It was, in fact, merely the reflection of a distant car's headlights on the wet glass, but in the pitch-black Highland night, it looked exactly like a torch moving inside the building. "There he is now," Hamish whispered, injecting a note of false urgency into his voice. "If you go through the tunnel now, you can get to the vault before they break the seal. You could move the smaller chests into the crawlspace. They'd never find them there." Hamish knew the psychology of the mooch. He had spent years getting people to give him information by making them feel like they were the ones in control. Now, he was doing the same with a killer. He wasn't threatening them, he was offering them a way to save their prize. "The tunnel is flooded," Penelope said, her voice sharp. "Only the main branch," Hamish countered. "The one by the lions is clear. I saw it myself when I was guarding the gate. If I were a man of your ambition, Penelope, I'd be down there right now. Of course, you could just shoot me and run, but Yow'd be leaving empty-handed while Blair gets the glory." It was the perfect trap. He had appealed to their greed, their arrogance, and their fear of the very man they despised. "Fergus, go," Penelope said suddenly. "Take the bag. I'll follow. And Macbeth, if you move an inch from this spot, I'll hear you. Lugs, too. I'll shoot the dog first." "I wouldn't dream of it," Hamish said, sitting on a cold stone bench and folding his arms. I'm quite content to watch the show, as Fergus scrambled toward the hidden entrance behind the stone lions, and Penelope followed, keeping her gun trained on Hamish until she reached the shadows. Hamish didn't move. He waited until he heard the heavy thud of the stone slab being shifted, sound of the tunnel entrance opening. As soon as they were out of sight, Hamish's lazy demeanor vanished. He didn't run for the tunnel. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy iron bar he had liberated from the garden shed earlier. He ran to the stone lions and, with a burst of the hidden physical strength he rarely showed, he jammed the bar into the mechanism of the slab. Then, he picked up a nearby heavy decorative urn and wedged it against the seal. "Right then, lugs," Hamish panted, his breath coming in short bursts of white mist. "That should hold them for a bit. Now, we just have to hope the rising tide does the rest of the work for us. The Atlantic has a very firm way of dealing with trespassers." He turned and began to run it away, but toward the police station. He didn't need a gun. He needed the one thing that would ensure the killers were caught red-handed without him having to fire a single shot. He needed DCI Blair's ego. Wait until he hears there's a massive criminal conspiracy waiting for him in the cellar. Hamish chuckled to himself. Hell be there faster than a dog after a sausage. As he ran through the rain, Hamish felt a grim satisfaction. He had played the part of the stupid policeman to perfection. He had mooched a confession out of them without even asking a question, and now he was going to let his boss take the credit and the paperwork. The police station door banged open against the wall, and Hamish Macbeth burst in, looking like a man who had just seen the Loch Ness Monster and lived to tell the tale. He was dripping wet, his red hair plastered to his forehead, and his chest was heaving with an exaggerated breathlessness that would have won him an award at any local dramatic society. "Sir! DCI Blair, sir!" Hamish gasped, leaning heavily against the doorframe. Blair, who had been halfway through a ham sandwich and a surly conversation with Mac Nab, jumped so violently that a piece of mustard-heavy crust landed on his tie. "Macbeth, what in the name of all that is holy are you doing? I told you to stay at the gate. The gate, sir. The lions. Thea in the tunnels." Hamish flailed a long arm toward the window. "I saw them. A gang of them. Professional looters from the city, armed to the teeth and carrying bags of what looked like solid gold. They've got a boat waiting in the cove, and Thea moving the horde as we speak." Blair's eyes didn't just widen, they practically vibrated in their sockets. The mention of gold and professional looters was like a siren song to his ambition. "Gold? In Lochtub? Mac Nab, get the riot gear. Get the sirens. We're going to catch a lot of them." "You must be careful, sir," Hamish added, his voice trembling with a fake, high-pitched anxiety. "The woman has a gun. She looks like a proper assassin. Maybe we should wait for backup from Inverness?" "Wait for backup?" Blair roared, grabbing his heavy trench coat. "And let someone else take the collar. Not in your life. We're going in now. Lead the way, Macbeth. And if you trip over your own feet, it'll leave you for the crabs." The procession that followed was the most excitement Lochtub had seen in decades. 2 police cruisers, lights flashing blue and white against the drenching rain, roared up the hill toward Ardvare House. Hamish sat in the back of Blair's car, looking properly terrified while secretly checking the time on his old wristwatch. The tide would be pushing into the lower drainage tunnels by now. If they didn't hurry, the suspects wouldn't just be trapped, they'd be swimming. They skidded to a halt near the stone lions. Blair leapt from the car, followed by Mac Nab and Anderson, who were clutching their batons with white-knuckled intensity. "There!" Hamish pointed to the heavy stone slab he had blocked. "They went down there. I managed to jam the door, but Thea tried to kick their way out from the inside. I can hear them screaming, sir. It sounds like a desperate gang of cutthroats." In reality, the muffled shouting coming from beneath the earth sounded more like Penelope's refined fury and Fergus' high-pitched wailing. But in the chaos of the rain and the sirens, it sounded dangerous enough for Blair. "Move that urn!" Blair commanded. As Mac Nab and Anderson heaved the decorative urn aside and Hamish pulled the iron bar free, the stone slab was kicked upward from below. A hand emerged, not clutching a bag of gold, but clawing at the muddy grass. Penelope climbed out first, her hair a sodden mess, her expensive trench coat ruined by tunnel silt and salt water. She was followed by Fergus, who was clutching a canvas bag and shivering so violently his teeth were clicking like castanets. "Police! Don't move!" Blair screamed, brandishing his torch like a weapon. Penelope, blinded by the flashing blue lights and the sudden glare of 4 powerful torches, squinted into the gloom. She reached for the pistol in her pocket, but her fingers were numb with cold and slick with seawater. Before she could even draw the weapon, Lugs, sensing the threat to his master, let out a thunderous bark and lunged forward, not to bite, but to create a terrifying wall of noise. Penelope stumbled back, her heel catching on a tree root, and she collapsed into a muddy puddle. The pistol skittered across the grass. "Got you!" Blair bellowed, throwing himself onto the shivering Fergus with the grace of a falling chimney. "Resisting arrest! Assaulting an officer! I've got you, you thieving scum!" Macnab was quicker, snapping the handcuffs onto Penelope before she could regain her dignity. She looked up, her gaze finding Hamish, who was standing safely behind Blair, looking like a concerned bystander. "You!" she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "You set us up!" There was no one in the Kirk. There was no backup. "I am sure I don't know what you're talking about, miss," Hamish said, his voice a picture of innocence. "I just saw suspicious activity and alerted my superior officer. DCI Blair here is a very sharp man. He's been onto your lions theory from the start." Blair, who was currently wrestling the canvas bag away from Fergus, puffed out his chest. "That's right. I knew this wasn't just a simple hanging. It's an international smuggling ring. I've been tracking the movements of these lions for hours." He ripped open the bag. Inside weren't just coins, but a collection of heavy silver chalices and a small lead-lined box that looked centuries old. The St. Ronan's hoard was real, and it was now officially in the possession of the Strathbane Police Department. "Take them to the vans," Blair ordered, his face glowing with a triumph so pure it was almost blinding. "And get a forensics team down that hole. I want every speck of dirt analysed. Macbeth, you stay here and secure the scene. And don't you dare touch that bag. This is a high-profile seizure." "As you say, sir," Hamish said, touching his cap. "I'll just stand here in the rain and keep an eye on things. Wouldn't want any more gold to go wandering off." As the vans sped away, their sirens failing into the distance, the silence returned to the grounds of Ardvere House. The rain began to let up, leaving the air smelling of wet earth and ancient secrets. Hamish walked to the hole and looked down. The water was rising fast. In another hour, the tunnel would be impassable. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, small silver coin he had found near the entrance before the police arrived. He flipped it by moonlight. It was a French louis d'or, dated 1745. "A long way from home, aren't you?" he whispered. He didn't put it in his pocket. Instead, he walked over to the old stone wall of the Kirk and tucked the coin deep into a crevice between the stones, where no city detective would ever think to look. It belonged to the hill, and to the hill it would stay. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish said, patting the dog's damp flank. "The excitement's over. Let's see if there's any of that stew left in the pot. I think we've earned ourselves a very long, very quiet sleep." The morning following the arrests dawned with a clarity that felt almost insulting after the previous night's gloom. The fog had vanished, chased away by a crisp northern breeze that turned the waters of the loch into a sparkling deep sapphire. In the village square, the Strathbane police vans were being packed with the last of the forensic equipment. A small crowd of locals had gathered to watch the town leave experts. Inside the police station, the air was thick with the aroma of Hamish's black coffee and the lingering scent of DCI Blair's self-importance. Blair was standing by the window, adjusting his tie and checking his reflection in the glass. He looked like a man who had just been handed the keys to the kingdom. On the desk lay a thick stack of reports, which Hamish had spent the early hours of the morning assisting Macnab to complete, ensuring that every mention of Hamish's own involvement was couched in terms of routine assistance and following the lead of the commanding officer. "Right then, Macbeth," Blair said, turning around with a smug grin that made his face look even rounder. "The Chief Constable is expecting a full briefing in an hour. This is the biggest recovery of historical artifacts in the history of the Highlands. Not to mention arresting a high-flying London lawyer for murder and conspiracy. This'll be on the front page of every paper from Wick to London." Hamish sat at his desk, looking properly cowed and impressively dim-witted. He was slowly stirring a spoon in a mug that contained more sugar than coffee. "It's a grand result for the force, sir. Truly grand. I was just telling the postmistress how your tactical manoeuvre with the sirens was what really broke the suspect's will. A masterstroke, if I may say so," Blair preened. "Well, it's about experience, Macbeth. Knowing when to apply pressure and when to wait. You did your part, I suppose. Guarding the gate is an essential, if menial, task. I'll be sure to mention in my report that you remained at your post." "Thank you, sir," Hamish said, his voice thick with a fake, humble gratitude. "I wouldn't want to be getting above my station. I am just happy the village is quiet again. I don't think I am built for the high-octane life of a detective. It gives me a terrible nervous stomach." Blair snorted, a sound of pure condescension. "You can say that again. You're a decent enough lad, Macbeth, but you lack the killer instinct. You're lucky I was here to take charge, or Yow'd still be scratching your head over those stone lions. It's good for you that I am moving on to bigger things. There's talk of a promotion to Assistant Chief Constable after this. He'll be based in Glasgow, of course, far away from this wet heap of rocks. Glasgow's game is our loss, sir, Hamish replied, managing to keep his face perfectly straight. As Blair marched out of the station to his waiting car, his chest puffed out so far he nearly tripped over the doorstep. Hamish watched him go through the window. He saw the DCI stop to give a brief, arrogant interview to a local reporter, gesturing wildly toward the hills as if he had personally wrestled the gold from the earth. Once the car had disappeared around the bend toward the mainland, Hamish let out a long, slow sigh of relief. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small, printed form. It was a recommendation for his own promotion to sergeant, a document Blair had been carrying for weeks but had never signed. Hamish walked over to the stove, lifted the lid, and dropped the paper onto the glowing embers. Too much responsibility. Lugs, he murmured to the dog, who was currently investigating a crumb near the radiator. Sergeants have to attend meetings. They have to wear ties every day. They have to leave Lochtub, and who would look after the salmon if I were gone? He left the station and headed toward the harbour. The village was returning to its natural rhythm. Mrs. Kennedy was back to weighing parcels. Mr. Patel was polishing the front window of the curry shop, and the old men were back on their bench, debating the merits of the incoming tide. He saw Priscilla Halberton-Smythe standing by her car near the hotel. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for the truth she knew was hidden there. "I hear Blair is the hero of the hour," she said, her voice carrying a hint of a smile. "The papers are calling him the Sherlock of the North. He seems to have forgotten that you were the one who found the tunnel." "Memory is a funny thing, Priscilla," Hamish said, leaning against a stone wall, "especially when there's a promotion on the line. I am just a humble village bobby who happened to be standing in the right place at the right time. Besides, I like my house. It has a very nice view of the loch, and the roof only leaks in 3 places." Priscilla stepped closer, her expression softening. "You're a strange man, Hamish Macbeth. You solve a murder, recover a lost treasure, and then give the credit to a man who couldn't find his own way out of a paper bag. Don't you ever want more?" Hamish looked out over the water, where a lone fisherman was rowing slowly toward the middle of the loch. The air was fresh, the mountains were eternal, and he had a pot of mutton stew waiting on the stove at home. "I have everything I want right here, Priscilla," he said. "The peace has been restored. The Sassenach has gone Ione way, or Anatharan, the bells of the kirk are silent again. A man could do a lot worse than that." She nodded, realizing that for Hamish, success wasn't measured in stripes on a sleeve or medals on a chest. It was measured in the ability to stay exactly where he belonged. She turned and drove away, leaving him in the quiet sunshine. Hamish walked back to his cottage, whistling a low, mournful Gaelic tune. He spent the afternoon tending to his small vegetable patch, pulling weeds with a slow, methodical patience. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the thatch of the roofs, he sat on his porch with a steaming mug of tea. Luggs sat beside him, his head resting on Hamish's knee. The choir loft mystery is over. The greed of the outsiders had been buried, and the secrets of the Highlanders remained safely tucked away in the shadows of the hills. "It was a busy few days, Luggs," Hamish whispered, stroking the dog's ears. "But I think we can manage to be properly lazy for at least a month now. Unless, of course, the postmistress starts seeing ghosts again." He closed his eyes, listening to the gentle wave of waves against the shore. He was Hamish Macbeth, the laziest policeman in the Highlands, and he was exactly where he wanted to be.